Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. This is the channel for photography and for wildlife photography. And in today's video, we're talking about symmetry and balance in your compositions. You're really going to enjoy this one. So stay tuned and we'll get to it right after this. Now you can find today's video down in the playlist, Learning or Photo Basics. We're going to be talking about the ideas of symmetry and balance and how you can use these concepts to improve the compositions of your photographs, whether they're wildlife or nature photographs or any photography in general. These ideas will apply to you. Let's start with a very basic concept around symmetry and how it applies to art. I'm going to flip screens over here and just show you a very classic painting. This is by Leonardo da Vinci. This is The Last Supper. What I want you to notice around this is not just the color and the poses and some of the other things that are going on here. I just want you to look at this idea of balance. Look at the number of disciples on the left and the number of disciples on the right. There's 6 on each side. Look at the tapestry on the wall. There's 4 panels on each wall. Look at the windows in the background with the arch mirrored left to right. Look at even the legs on the table and the patterns on the tablecloth and the lines on the floor. Everything in this photo has balance. And when I mention this, you're going to hear ideas like vertical symmetry or horizontal symmetry, even radial symmetry. What I want you to understand, and when we talk about vertical symmetry, I'm going to refer to this idea of what is on the left is balanced by what is on the right. Sometimes it's even reflected by the left and right. In this picture, we just have tremendous balance. So in art, these ideas of symmetry are all over the place. I want to show you one image that I took years ago with multiple subjects, not a lot, but multiple, that has a really good sense of balance and symmetry. So let's just notice what's on the left is reflected and balanced by what is on the right. And it's almost right down the middle. You know, compositionally, we are told very basic rules, things like the rule of thirds. Put your subject off to the left or off to the right and put it a little bit down in the frame or maybe a little bit up in the frame. Don't center the subject. But when we look at this, you'll notice that the main subject is actually centered right down the middle. Because this talks more about overall composition, these ideas of symmetry will often involve composing things right down the middle, perhaps vertically or perhaps even horizontally. And I've got images in here to show you. I really think you're going to like this. By the way, there's some reflection in this, but this one is really about a vertical symmetry, left and right. Now let's go through and talk about the opposite of symmetry. I reference this idea of rule of thirds. By the way, the patrons will be credited down below me, so I'll put their names down there. I'm not going to rattle off all their names because there's a lot of images to get through today, but I do want to thank all my patrons for jumping in on this one. A lot of submissions, a lot of images to go through. We'll move quickly, but I just want to reinforce these concepts. Now, this is not the actual composition that the photographer sent me. I took some liberties in Photoshop to compose this to a standard rule of thirds. We put it down on the bottom third, we put it over to the left third, and there's a lot of negative space. So you just see this empty area. This is an unbalanced composition. And I have to say this before we get any further in the video. There's no right or wrong here. This is a video about the idea of symmetry, but there's nothing to say that one composition is better or worse. What I do want you to understand is different compositions can have different purposes. And with symmetrical composition or balanced composition, often it gives us a sense of ease. I'll explain this a little bit further when I get to some of the other images, but let's just take a look at the different compositions that we could have in this. Here's the asymmetrical or unbalanced composition. This is the original composition, which has much more balance. Now I want you to notice, I don't have a lot of examples in this video of this balanced composition using objects, but this idea of putting an object on one side to balance the subject on the other is very, very common. Now we're not using exact symmetry here, but we are talking about this idea of balance. I thought this was a great example of that. Even the stick at the bottom with the moon, that creates I call it weight. So it puts a weight on one side to balance the weight on the other side. One of the things about symmetry is that we often find this in nature. And since I'm a plant enthusiast, I find this in my plants all the time. Before we get into the wildlife and bird, let me just quickly go through a couple of these images. And you're going to see this vertical symmetry. What is on the left, in this case, is mirrored by what is on the right. It's reflected by what is on the right. Now, this isn't true mirrored symmetry, but you can see that it's very, very close, and this occurs naturally. Here's another example of vertical symmetry. What's on the left is balanced by what is on the right, and in this case, almost reflected by what is on the right. And there's an idea of radial symmetry. We're not going to deal a whole lot with this, but I do want to point this out because it occurs often with flowers. We see these shapes and these patterns that go around in circles. I want you to notice, again, the composition. If we were to put a center point of this image, this flower is placed almost exactly in the middle of the frame. And that creates this left to right balance. And in this case, it's also balanced top and bottom. Radial symmetry, by the way, will be a repeating circular pattern. We find radial symmetry much more often in man-made objects because we can create that. Digital artists will do this sometimes, but you'll see architecture that features radial symmetry, these ideas of patterns going around in circles and repeating themselves around in circles. Very, very interesting. And again, I find it a little bit more in nature than I do with wildlife. Now we're going to talk quickly about balancing objects in the frame. And for that, let's get to some of our patrons. This first image shows some balance between two subjects. In other words, what is weighted on the top is balanced by what is weighted on the bottom. I think this is actually a pretty incredible photo, and I really wanted to include it in this video. So it gives you a sense, though, you can see how there's balance amongst these subjects. Let's talk a little bit about two subjects in a frame and how they can be balanced. You'll see the point made very quickly here. We've got two cormorants sitting on a perch, one on the left, balanced by one on the right. I also want you to notice the poses are identical or virtually identical. That's a different compositional theory. You'll hear this idea of repetition being very appealing in artwork. A lot of times that repetition occurs in more than two things, but it certainly could apply to this image where we've got this repeating of poses. Very similarly, two subjects facing the same direction, almost identical posing, balancing the left with what is on the right. Not a mirror image. A mirror image would actually have them facing each other. I've got some examples of that in just a minute. Here's a really nice one. Again, this idea of repeating the pose left and right, but also balancing the frame left and right. Really, and a beautiful picture, by the way, of these sandhill cranes. Now I'm going to show you a couple more. These are a little bit more mirrored than they are repeating. So let's just look at this. Got some deer here, again, left and right, balanced very well. This one's interesting because the poses are mirror images of each other, in this case facing away from the frame. I will say the light is a little asymmetrical, so there's more light on one side of the frame than the other, but I thought these poses were a really good example of this idea of mirrored symmetry. This one is really, really good because everything's kind of even in the frame, so the coloring in the background, the lighting is very neutral. And we see that same idea where it's, if we split it down the middle, the poses are almost identical left and right. Probably the best example I had of this was this idea of mirrored symmetry where the subjects were facing each other. This way they're not pushing out against the sides of the frame. We've got these little icicles hanging down from a wire, and there's a symmetry in that. There's a balance in that. In other words, the amount on one side is very close to the amount on the other. But then you just look at the pose of these two birds. This is a gorgeous, just a gorgeous photograph. So really nice job. This is Crystal Migliori. I am trying to get all the names down there below, but I wanted to call this one out because I think of all of the mirrored symmetry that I had, this one is probably one of the best examples of that, where it's not truly a reflection, but it's so close, the poses are so close to each other that it almost looks like it's a mirrored image left to right. And again, I want you to notice that composition. If we drew a line right down the middle, it would split those birds in half. So we're not necessarily always setting things off to the side, like I showed you in that rule of thirds composition. A lot of times with symmetry, we're using the top, the line down the middle, the vertical line, or even the horizontal line. Show you a little bit of that as we approach this next concept of reflective symmetry and horizontal symmetry. We see this almost always with water. So some very easy examples to identify. Here you see it, what's on the top reflected by what's on the bottom. And in this case, the water is truly offering itself as a mirror. Shorebirds works really, really well. I do want you to notice the patterns. There's nothing wrong with having some texture in the water to give some shape to the subject. Really up to the viewer to decide what they like better or what the photographer likes better. Here, the water's a little smoother, so it really works as a mirror. This is another example of very mirrored symmetry. What's on the top is reflected by what's on the bottom. Little texture on this one, so a mirrored image, but textured. And then a lot of texture in this image. I actually like this one. It's very minimalistic, Very simple, a lot of negative space. And that reflection wasn't a perfect reflection, but it is balanced. So in other words, what's on the top was balanced a little bit by what's on the bottom. When it comes to perspective, I'm going to show you 3 images real quick, and I just want you to see something about perspective, all right? So just notice the perspective on these 3 images. I preach getting as low as possible for my subjects. Eye level, really, really low. So shorebirds, a couple inches off the ground, waders, maybe 6 inches to a foot off the ground. But these last 3 were actually taken a little bit higher than that. When dealing with reflections, and this is more of a tip for when you're in the field or what to think about. You take a lot of photos, by the way. Just continue to take photos and see what happens. As you raise your perspective, often your reflections are going to be a little bit purer. They're going to look more like the subject. Using that still water is really beneficial. So if you've got not a windy day, if you want to photograph some of these reflections, find a shallow pool. Hopefully you've got some subjects that are working in that pool. And it's not just birds, because I want to show you this next image. Look at the reflection here. That water is glass, and it's almost a perfect reflection of what's on top. So this reflective symmetry, really, really powerful. Probably my favorite reflection was this one. I really loved how the tail just worked its way into the water and came right back around. It's like there's 2 subjects, but they're joined by the tail. Only the tail in the water. Just really, really cool. So a great example of this horizontal symmetry. So what's on the top reflected by what's on the bottom. And then again, we would call this reflective because it truly is a mirrored image. I'm going to transition now, and I'm going to get a little bit out of this reflective idea and into just some poses that offer a lot of symmetry. These had both elements. So you'll see, subject, left and right. I just want you to notice individual subjects, left and right, balance left and right, also reflections. And I'm going to stop on this one. This one is a great illustration of all of that. So as we transition from this reflective symmetry or this mirrored symmetry, and we move into this concept that we're going to call bilateral symmetry. And bilateral, it's not a tricky term. It just means what's on the left is what's on the right. So we see bilateral symmetry, by the way, as people and animals, we almost always see bilateral symmetry. It is not a perfect science, but I want you to think of the human head, the human face, what's on the left reflected by what's on the right. There's also this idea about the better the bilateral symmetry, the more pleasing it is to the human. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but there is a belief out there that bilateral symmetry is very, very appealing to people. But I'm going to tell you this, as a philosophy, symmetry tends to bring us feelings that are peaceful and calming. There's some ideas around it's easy for our brain to digest symmetry. We find it very appealing. And for that reason, I just think it works super in nature. Nature to me is a calming influence. So nature to me, when I have symmetry in it, it does evoke these very peaceful feelings. I have to say this on any video I do about composition, there's no right or wrong. You can compose however you want. In fact, some people will compose not to evoke feelings of peace, but actually to provide tension. So things that might break rules sometimes can also be very, very powerful. So there's no right or wrong. There's no one way to do this. But I wanted to talk about this idea of bilateral symmetry because you're going to start to see it a lot here. As we get wings balanced left to right, draw a line down the middle. Draw a line down the middle, wings left, mirror what's on the right. And notice we're not using a reflection to do this. It's just the pose of the animal, in this case, the pose of the birds, where the symmetry, if you drew it down the middle, it almost looks like there's a mirror there and what's on the left is also on the right. These all vertically symmetrical. So everything that I'm showing you now, and this generally happens with birds because they have wings and the wings are side to side. We don't see a lot of, in nature, we don't see a lot of symmetry that's up and down unless it's reflective. Now, again, flowers and plants, a little bit different. You do see that, but with animals, you tend to see this symmetry left to right or bilateral symmetry. I'm going to show you a couple more now. We're going to move out of these birds and I'm going to show you some bilateral symmetry. This is a smaller in frame image, but you can see right down the middle, what's on the left appears to be also what's on the right. It works well when you get close. So when you get, and when you get it perfect, and you look at this one and you're like, that is almost perfect. Even the horns, the way they come out and arch together, they're right at the same height. Like everything about that has this great symmetry. And when we get tight, we see all that. I mean, look at this, like just when it's dead on, really, really, really powerful. Now, as we return to the birds, we're going to see some more bilateral symmetry. In this case, with some waterfowl in the water when they're swimming right at the camera. It's really, really neat. And in fact, it's not just the subject here. I started a little bit looser with this little duckling, but the pattern of the water, there's symmetry in that pattern of the water. If we drew a line right down the middle, you would probably see that the left is almost perfectly balanced to the right. Let's get a little bit closer. We've got some wood ducks here. For whatever reason, wood ducks just make a great subject. So just notice right down the middle. This has that reflective element as well. But if we're looking at this bilateral symmetry, and the closer it is to perfect, the more appealing sometimes it becomes. And don't be afraid to get in tight with this. Like, look at how neat that looks. And the lighting on this one is actually balanced. Sometimes with bilateral images, we may get lighting on one side of the face, which creates in itself asymmetry in the lighting. In this case, the lighting is also very balanced. So it's very, very, very powerful. I'm going to get in a little bit closer. I think this might be one of the best images that I had to show you this. Look at this one. Just a super image. The symmetry in this is just almost perfect. Even the little leaf down there appears to have symmetry left and right. And I want you to notice the composition. If we were to draw a line right down the middle, that's where this is going to be composed left and right. And probably those eyes, while I don't have the graph up here to show you, those eyes, I bet you they're right down the middle as well. So not a rule of thirds composition on almost any of these, but they all work. So when we're composing for symmetry, often the idea of composing down the middle, whether it's horizontally up and down or vertically left and right, can be very, very powerful. Now I'm going to wrap this video up. Hopefully these illustrations helped you. I'm going to put up an image that I had that's actually titled Symmetry, and it was one of my most popular images. And there it is. Just notice when it's composed right down the middle and the way those wings almost mirror each other, they almost match each other. These are very, very powerful images. They don't always happen intentionally. One of the disadvantages I think we have as wildlife photographers is that it becomes very, very difficult to get the composition in the field that you have imagined. So you're like, I gotta want this head-on image, but I need the subject to cooperate. My belief, that is what separates wildlife photography from a lot of other genres and what makes it very, very difficult, because often we have these ideas of what we want. I can remember I had this idea in my head for a long time. I wanted to get these skimmers perfectly head on, but I can't tell it what to do. I just have to wait until it happens. And so it took a lot of effort to get this image. It took a lot of energy and a lot of time, but eventually it happened. And when it does, it looks really, really, really powerful. So this particular image is actually titled Symmetry. Now, if you're a wildlife photographer, you know how difficult it is to get some of these things to line up just perfectly. But when they do, I hope these examples really illustrated the point about how powerful they can be. One of the things I've appreciated about macro photography a little bit more over the last couple of years is my ability to compose and work with a subject that I can work and move and manipulate a little bit more. So whether it's flowers or leaves or even insects that are perfectly still, in camera, I have the ability to compose. Whereas with wildlife and birds, it's often a little bit more challenging to get these things to happen. So it takes a lot of time. But when it happens, I think you can agree, these images show you, when it happens, it's really, really, really powerful. So think about some of the things we talked about in this video, whether it's bilateral symmetry or vertical symmetry, reflective symmetry. We showed some examples of radial symmetry. There's a lot out there, and feel free to continue to explore on your own. After all, that is part of the adventure of photography, continuing to learn, continuing to grow, continuing to experiment, and ultimately, hopefully, getting some images that are really, really pleasing and sometimes a little different. Now, if you're not subscribed to the channel, go down and hit that subscribe button, and I've got a lot of playlists down there, so check out some of these playlists. I've got gear reviews and opinion pieces down there that you're going to find enjoyable. If you haven't hit the bell for notifications, that only lets you know when I have a new video out. So go ahead and hit that out. You'll get a new video about once a week on this channel. As always, I appreciate your time and energy in watching the video, and I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.